I'll tell you what, we're going to get to know our panel a little bit, and then we're going to open it up for questions. I believe there's a couple folks walking around with microphones, so we do want you definitely to engage in this part of the town hall meeting. This is your chance to really ask specific questions or to make comments. The more provocative, the better. We like that a lot. I want to introduce our panel here this morning. As some of you may be familiar with, right next to me is Steve Drockler. He's Executive Director of the United Methodist Advocacy in Pennsylvania. He's a former award-winning reporter, a congressional staffer, a former press secretary to a certain state house leader. He's seen it all, both on the outside and the inside of state government, the good, the bad, literally, and the ugly. We also have with us someone very interesting, Lorenza Andrade Smith. And Lorenza is, she believes that she can best serve the homeless persons by becoming homeless herself. That's exactly what she did in June 2011. She gave up her salary, her insurance benefits, her car, and her home to move on to the streets of Southwest Texas to live and serve as a homeless person. She's going to have some interesting things to say. And we also have with us the Reverend Faith Fowler. She's senior pastor of Cass Community UMC and executive director of Cass Community Social Services in Detroit. And she also finished the Boston Marathon 4 times.
Oh, my God.
That is amazing. I'm very impressed with that. I want to start actually with Lorenza, though. Lorenza, I wondered if you could share with us some of your experiences. As I understand it, since Friday, you have been living on the streets here in Harrisburg in our community. Tell us a little bit about what that was like, and also why you chose this path of ministry.
First, I think I resonate with what Pastor Slaughter has said about serving. And I think that God certainly calls all of us, and God has called me in this way. And so I'm very privileged to serve, and so I do my best to learn and to live with. I think Chris this morning said it eloquently. We're in ministry with, and so my desire is to be with, walk with, learn from those who are in our communities that sometimes are in the shadows and in the margins. And so I'm just privileged. I've stayed, very symbolically, I've stayed at the Capitol here in Pennsylvania. I found a bench that had the word liberty on there. And so I slept there. And I think we have this liberty to be compassionate. We have a liberty to love. We have a liberty to act justly. And so not to confuse that with other types of liberty. And the next night, I met some folks here already the first night, and the next night I stayed over at the park by the river. And we had about, I think there were 6 of us, and that was our community. That was our home. Wherever I do go, right now, Camp Hill is my home. Tonight will be Hills, Harrisburg. Downtown. And so wherever I go, an African-American woman taught me in New York when I called myself homeless. She told me, young lady, you are not homeless. Your home is with God, and God has created our land here. So I live on the streets, and so I'm privileged again in this appointment, and I just love God for the opportunity to serve in this way.
Before we move on, before the program started, I asked you what struck you the most? Which city affected you deeply? And you had a very specific answer.
I just was at Skid Row, Los Angeles. And for me, I've been to New York, D.C., many, many cities. But Los Angeles seemed the visibility of thousands of people who live on the streets was almost overwhelming. But the impact was to live there with my neighbors and to meet and be in relation with specific person and persons. And so I think to look globally is so difficult. It's such a complex issue, like most of us have talked about, that we need to walk, humbly, like Reverend Slaughter mentioned. and be able to be open to the relationship and the spirit where God already is in those on the streets. And so that's been a gift for me. Though it was most difficult, it was certainly a much gifted time for me and a transformational time for my life.
Steve had mentioned, though, that you plan to do this for 3 years, and I'm just curious. We've talked here about walking humbly, and you certainly are doing that. But if we're going to talk about advocacy, there's a certain element of power behind that question. What are you going to do with it? Bob Casey, I worked for him for a while. He's a former governor of Pennsylvania. He's now deceased. But he always said, what did you do when you had the power? What are you going to do with the power of what you're learning over the course of these 3 years on the streets?
Well, first I'm appointed by the bishop every year, and the commitment is 3 years, but we will see how that goes. That's I will go wherever the bishop sends me, and with a smile, of course. Advocacy and making just systemic changes is my ministry. I'm appointed to ministry with the poor and marginalized, advocating for just systemic changes. And in solidarity, I live among those who live on the streets. So many in the denomination and otherwise have focused on this last part that for me was just a part of this, the living on the streets. I'm in ministry with the poor and marginalized, advocating for just systemic changes. And I think we're real good at the charity part, and I think we need to applaud, the United Methodist Church. Now let's move then from our Sunday school charity and move into the young adult and adult classes of systemic changes. And so I think that's one of the issues that is so important to move forward, to grow in our discipleship. Exactly what both Faith and Mike Slaughter have said is we need to grow and be grounded in the theology. I'm appointed to do nothing but communicate the love of God, and I'll leave it up to you all to ground me theologically. But I think we need to work together in that venue and be authentic in our discipleship and in our gift and our calling. We're all called to different things, and I want to be authentic to my calling. So I may not be able to do everything, but I hope that what I am called to do will advocate, will bring the issue to the surface in local congregations, will stir the hearts of people. Whether we change, I always say, and I learned from a friend, law and justice are related but not always aligned. And we're trying to align that. And there's ways to do that, and different ways to do that. And we need everyone's gift to be able to do that and to accomplish that.
Faith, I'll skip down to you. In reading about your life, it says you work with the hungry, homeless, seniors, unemployed, at-risk youth, mentally ill, developmentally challenged, people with HIV/AIDS, Alzheimer's patients, and you run 2 free medical clinics through your Cass Community Social Services in Detroit. That about touches it all. Lorenza comes from southwestern Texas. You're in a very different environment there in urban Detroit. Talk a little bit about Mike Slaughter's message, how it applies to the kinds of things you're doing and advocating in the community.
They put me on the spot, huh?
Yeah.
Great message. First of all, I'm humbled. What great work you're doing. I've read about you over the years, but didn't realize the most recent stuff. We've gone from charity, a soup kitchen, clothing closet, furniture giveaway, to developing people to be ready for jobs, to be free of drugs and alcohol, to developing a community that's pedestrian where there's no longer a poverty of opportunity for people, if you will, that they can walk to work, they can walk to classes, they can walk to worship, while we work on mass transit in the Motor City, where half the citizens don't have cars. So there's the sense both that we're attempting to do long-term systemic change and short-term development of people and communities as we develop as Christians. And I appreciated what he had to say about that.
One of the things, can I mention, you said about the pedestrian zone. How the world has changed. The whole church growth movement was kind of based on a regional church, a church that was healthy, and then people would drive in from all the towns and so forth. But it was also still based on that urban churches were escaping to suburbs. And so even today, some of the big churches in America, when they create another campus, they're doing it in movie theaters, they're doing it in homogeneous kind of places. 84% of Americans today live in urban areas. 84%. The very places that many United Methodists tried to escape in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Now here's the problem. 74% of our churches are where only 16% of the American population live. 74% of United Methodist churches are in small town, rural areas where only 16% of the population now live. And we're sending sometimes our young new pastors into areas. We're sending people to buildings, not populations. So what we began to see a decade or more ago, that we needed to reclaim, I call them green churches, because instead of spending money on brick, let's minimize brick and maximize mission. Let's reclaim these urban churches in struggling communities and let these churches become the pedestrian empowering centers of those communities. And you've got to make sure they're in walking distance. So we talk about churches, we talk about 15-block areas. In Dayton, Ohio, we're looking at churches in 15-block areas. In the Fort McKinley neighborhood, we have done something now on every one of those blocks to improve that neighborhood, whether with new houses, community gardens, the GED programs people can walk to, the Jobs for Life programs people walk to. We're right on a bus line. That is so important, what you said. So we've got to rethink neighborhood churches. You know, the mega church is kind of a thing. There'll always be mega churches, but the regional church is not going to be effective in this post-industrial urban era.
If I could,
Yeah.
our most recent, we have a satellite. We're a small church with a satellite, and it's not in a church building at all. It's in a warehouse with a cement floor and a podium that sometimes we use. I think we have to get away from those of us who've served in the city have had hand-me-down churches. I like to say I had 3 older brothers, and I always got their clothes growing up, which wasn't much fun. But pastors go into churches with years of deferred maintenance.
Oh, yeah.
And so you spend all your time struggling to fix a roof or put in a furnace or deal with gutters or insure the darn thing or heat it. And it's a waste of time. Jesus doesn't care about buildings.
Right.
Or windows or pews or furnaces or gutters.
We just opened a brand new campus. It's called The Point in a shopping center. And so we went in and we call it mud and spit with paint and people that know how to put up some walls and so forth. Did you get to go to The Point when you were there?
I sure did, yes.
And so it's in a partnership with a pizza place and a YMCA and so forth. So we have deferred rent payments going into this place because it's a struggling area. Deferred rent payments or utility payments for 3 years. Going in, and then we found grants for $250,000 over a 3-year period, and you got to visit that place on Saturday night. So it's brand new. We just opened it on Easter weekend. We have about 100 people in that church at this time, but the same thing. Look at the area. Look at the area and then get creative of how can we move in that area.
I want to move to Steve for a second. When he called me about doing this, he pointed out you have 2,300 congregations here in the UMC Church in Pennsylvania. That's over about 500,000 members. And if you think about it, 500,000 members, that's a potentially pretty powerful lobbying group in and of itself. How do you effectuate change here in state government? And I think what Steve said he wanted to do was really shake things up. And you've talked about a new revolution. Give us an idea of what you're thinking about the power of the advocacy and what will separate the United Methodist Church's advocacy from those of all the other lobbying groups and all the other lobbying individuals who come to Harrisburg, many of whom are out there to help the poor, the oppressed, and those who are unjustly circumstanced in life.
I think that we have to change the conversation. I'm thrilled to learn this morning that we've been part of a coalition, a significant part of a coalition that has been fighting the predatory payday lending industry, which has been working since 2005 to come into Pennsylvania. And they renewed their efforts very quietly in the beginning, early this year, in pouring hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, hiring 5 high-price lobbying firms, traveling across the state, meeting with legislators, Republicans and Democrats, seeking to bring in companies that would charge 300 to 400% for short-term loans to people who are struggling to exist from day to day. Well, it's been reported this morning that they have abandoned their effort for this session. Now, that's the good news. But come January, when the new session opens, they'll be right back at it. Because as they say, and as they have told people, and even told me, that we're going to keep at it till we beat you. That's how gambling was expanded here. That's how the forces looking to privatize our liquor system are at work here. And so we find ourselves, and it's a little odd for me, and we find ourselves working not so much to say yes to getting things happen, but to saying no, because many of the things that our people are trying to get through are wrong. They go against our belief systems and our traditions. They go contrary to what Scripture tells us. I know that in my work, and I have it on the back of my business cards now, because I want to remind anyone who gets my business card and looks at it as to why we do what we do, why I do what I do. And it's very simple. It boils down to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and needy. From Proverbs 31, verses 8 and 9. And I believe, and Mike, the reason I invited Mike here was I read his book, Hijacked, and talked to him at General Conference, and realized that so often in my work, people send me emails and they write and they stop and I go into churches and they say the church should not be involved in politics. It's none of our affair. We should not be involved. We shouldn't do that. And it's a difficult process that we're involved in to say that no, we should be involved. Not in Republican or Democrat politics, but to be bringing God's perspective by, as I mentioned yesterday, slowly touching hearts and changing minds, by getting more and more people to speak out, to contact their legislators, to begin developing relationships with their elected officials, to begin teaching, educating. I mean, lobbying, in effect, is educating, except what we do, We don't hand out big checks with campaign contributions. The power of what we have is the power of the risen Christ. It's the power of the prophets, as we heard from Isaiah today. It's the power of people speaking out. And legislators, I spent a long time in the system. And what your elected officials want to do, they like to say yes. Because they know when they say yes, that improves their chances of reelection. So if you have a legislator who is always saying no to his and her constituents, that will have an impact when people go to vote in the next election. And so we do that humbly. I undergird what I do with prayer. When I meet with legislators, I don't approach, they all know me from my time here as a reporter for 15, 20 years, and from my time here as the press secretary and spokesperson for the Speaker and leader of the House, which was a very partisan role. And so I came back here not as a change person, because I always was a person of faith and had many things in ministry, but I come back here from a different perspective, and I approach them from a prayerful perspective. A number of times that I have met with legislators and we end with prayer. We do public prayer vigils. When you go to the Capitol in Washington, D.C., you get arrested for praying in the Capitol. Thank goodness nobody's thought of that here in Harrisburg, because we have prayer vigils in the Capitol.
Can I ask you something, though, Steve? We live at the same time in a society in which it's very clear there should be a separation between church and state. And I'm curious, when you come to advocacy from a theological perspective and a belief in Jesus Christ and the principles that he laid out, do politicians have a difficult time with that, saying, I can't make decisions based on my faith. I have to make decisions based on fiscal reality. What can the state afford? The idea of the political realities that are out there. You touched on it, Mike, yourself, that are the poor because of a lack of initiative. How do you confront that idea that your theological beliefs, your moralistic beliefs might be nice, but this is the real world, and we have to legislate in the real world?
A good example. Now, that's a very good question. And I think that our system is based on the Judeo-Christian belief system to bring folks back to those basic foundations. I deal with it all the time. A good example is that in this last year, Governor Corbett proposed major changes in funding for counties that receive funds for various human services, for mental health, for some health issues for the homeless, a whole variety of issues through the Human Resources Development Fund. He had proposed cutting that fund by $166 million and shifting more responsibilities to the counties and away from the state. And, we approach that, those of us from faith traditions. And I want to recognize the Reverend Amy Ruman from the Lutheran Advocacy in Pennsylvania, my colleague who is here with us today, sitting in the back. But we work together in a coalition of faith groups, Christian, Jewish. We are Christian, Jewish, Protestants, Roman Catholics. We have Buddhists. We've had, and it's a rainbow. But we proceed on the perspective of what our faiths say, and working in coalitions. And most of what I do, because mine is not a full-time job, is we have power in coalitions. And in the end of that budget, instead of being, I hate to declare victory by cutting a cut in half, but instead of being cut by $166 million, it was cut by about $82 million. And so, but that was based upon people understanding their moral obligation to serve the poor in Pennsylvania. You know, understanding government's role in protecting the poor and serving, and you know, and so that constant conversation, you know, and people looking in the eye and say, yes, I know that, and so we'll try to find a solution. And so it's hard work, it's incrementalism a lot of times, but you know, and not getting bogged down in the political Republican versus Democrat, but talk about what's right. Talk about people in their communities, talking about the fact that poverty is not an urban issue, that there are poor people in every municipality, every county. Poverty is highest in our rural counties than it is in the cities in Pennsylvania. And so I've made it part of what I do to talk to rural legislators and give them the data to do that. And our voices here is to get more and more United Methodists to contact legislators, because I can do a pretty good job of communicating from here. But without people, you all, and the folks in your congregations responding, that's where the power comes from.
One thing, Mike Slaughter had said something about we don't know about outhouses here in Pennsylvania. I can assure you I was doing, it was a good 15 years ago probably, this Pennsylvania's death penalty law was before the Supreme Court, and one of the men who was on death row was from southwestern Pennsylvania. I went to interview his parents, and I assure you there was barely running water in the house. So we do have pockets of severe poverty. And again, that was not urban Pennsylvania. That was a rural community in southwestern Pennsylvania. But I want to talk a little bit, too, when you talk tax policy. For instance, my brother and I were on Facebook, and I asserted something about tax policy, and he wrote, "You need to reread Matthew. You need to reread your Bible." And it was an interesting question about what we are compelled to do, again, by our faith when it comes to actually instituting changes in the law. Lorenzo talked about that a little bit, justice and law. There's a difference between what the law of the land is versus what is justice. But again, that comes a bit from our own Judeo-Christian tradition. What do we believe justice is? Your book and your central premise that Jesus isn't a Democrat, Jesus isn't a Republican, Jesus isn't a communist, how do you see us getting to unity through our diversity, a diversity that is extremely polarized at the moment? Literally, people cannot even listen to what another candidate might have to say if the person is of another party than theirs.
Well, you know, I speak purely from the position as a follower of Christ, and what I believe is that we represent an alternative to even the American system, and that we stay in a political, that we create a prophetic political tension with any worldly system. And it's why, I keep answering this question to new people, why we don't have an American flag in the church, because the church it's kind of like the UN. Even though it's in New York, it's not American soil. So the prophetic, here's an example with the taxation, prophetic tension that we have to ask is theologically, and I'm coming theologically, is the cut between the military piece of pie and the social service piece of pie and the education piece of pie. The voice of the Judeo-Christian community that is so critical is to really, as our theological position is, hey, our strength is not in our chariots and horses. Now, I'm not arguing whether we need to have some defense or no. No, I'm not. We have to be the moral conscience here. So the military always gets a really big piece of the pie, like 10 times more than any government in the world, I believe. So what do we do, even just with the tax structure we have? when morally we have to address both social services to folks as well as educational systems. And I think that's where the Judeo-Christian, and especially the church, where I speak from, is that we don't see this red or blue. We bring a theological perspective to this. And so right now you see that within our current budget system, the military has a huge piece of the pie. And how that needs to be distributed just based on justice kind of issues. That's where from a Christian, that's where I speak.
Yeah, I think in looking, in state government, we don't have the huge military, and it's broken down. In education, gets the biggest chunk, followed by services to people, such as long-term care and medical assistance are the biggest pieces of the Department of Public Welfare's budget. Yet the controversy is about we spend too much on welfare. We all hear that. But when you break it down, these are services that people that we know and we love depend upon. The recent decision to do away with general assistance, the reality of that is that general assistance had been shrinking over the years, and that eliminating that $205 a month to about 70,000 people in Pennsylvania, in reality, is a tiny piece of the pie. Unless you're one of those 70,000 people who are in transition from illness, who are waiting for their long-term disability payments to begin, who are receiving basic subsidies for housing, food stamps, and depend upon that $205 a month for everything else that they do. And we have created such a climate in our state and our country through the stereotyping and the racism and the classism that we creating these perceptions about people taking advantage of the system, when the reality is it's a very, very small. And so all these folks lost their funding. And the rationale was that, well, they can go find it somewhere else. Well, over the past 10 years, the services to the poor they've been chipping at that more and more. And our churches do a wonderful job, could do a lot better, but they say, well, the state shouldn't provide help to the poor. It should be up to our churches and our synagogues and other faith institutions. And so we're working to do that. But I think to keep that in perspective and to get folks to speak out and to understand that when they talk about these broad swaths, it is real people in real needs. Yesterday I spoke about 1 in 6 Pennsylvanians live under the federal definition of poverty, and about 1.9 million Pennsylvanians receive some sort of benefit, whether it be food stamps, whether that be lottery funding. Hate to use the word lottery, but they do. And so people depend upon that. But I think that piggybacking what Mike said on a state level, we've got to make that clear and show that we're at the point where we've gone past trimming the fat we've gone past people losing muscle, and now we're cutting off feet and hands, and pretty soon we'll get to the arms and legs because of the political climate, which is so opposed to spending money.
When I interviewed former Congressman Tony Hall, Ambassador Tony Hall, strong Christian Democrat from Ohio, he said that people keep saying it's up to faith-based organizations to take care of the poor. He said, well, 90% of emergency food distribution in this country is faith-based organizations. 90%, but it's 93% funded by the government. We get a semi every week of food from Shared Harvest, which is government food for our food pantries. So Tony Hall in my book, Hijack, goes, okay then, church, get with it. Get beyond the 7%. Well, obviously, based on only a study I read last week, only 20.4% of Americans are involved in church. 20.4%. We can't fill that gap. We can do a lot more. I think it's pretty big that 90% of all food distribution in America is faith-based. But again, we have to, when we talk about tax systems and everything, we have to sit down and do the hard work of how we fill that gap.
Let me just say, if you have questions, I think now's probably a good time to start having you guys jump in. So if somebody wants to ask something, that would be great. Yes, ma'am. I'll tell you what, we'll come right back to you. I want to ask Kay something. And I'll throw this out there. I know it stirs up controversy when you say it, but some people will point to Scripture and say, Jesus said, you will have the poor with you always. There are many interpretations of what that meant. But what do you do with folks who, for some people, having pockets of poverty can be politically helpful?
Is that to me?
Yes.
Can I back up to the last?
You may.
Thank you. The gap between the rich and the poor is obscene. And Scripture, the prophets speak about that. It's not that wealth is bad, the love of money is bad, but wealth isn't necessarily bad. But the UN set up Millennium Goals and has done a very good job at focusing us at people living at $1 a day or less, and now $2 a day or less. And there's been some real progress that we can celebrate for all but the bottom billion, and we've got to figure out how to change that situation. But I don't hear Democrats or Republicans talking about an agenda for dealing with poverty in the United States. We don't even have any goals. When you talk about 1 out of 5 kids being poor, rural, city, black, white, generational, working poor, single parent, we're not even talking about it.
Why not? Why do you think we're not talking about it?
Well, because I think politicians today are bought and sold. And because the church isn't being the church. I mean, the church has lost its prophetic fervor. Jesus' first sermon is, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. I've come with good news for the poor.
Well, that's what, when Steve said it's an anti-poverty summit, what, and at the risk of saying something offensive, what the hell do you want people to do?
Well, thank you. Well, I'd like them to, I preached here yesterday, I'd like them to do something. I'd like them to identify the needs that are most critical to poor people and to stand up and be sacrificial not only in their giving, but in their time and their talent and a force to put. I mean, politicians aren't going to do what we don't require of them, request of them, demand of them, and corporations won't either. And so we have a role to play in this gridlock, if you will, by talking about food security and housing security and education opportunity and, lenders who are taking advantage of poor people. I mean, there's a whole laundry list of places we can be engaged and effective, and it has to do with our spiritual health as well. We've gotten I think we're too obsessed with church growth. What's the size of your membership? What's the size of your budget? What's the size of your seating capacity for Sunday morning? And if we want to be obsessed with numbers, how many kids make it to birth? You want to talk about pro-life? Who's getting prenatal care? I'm pro-life, but I care about Head Start and public education, and that's life too. I believe life is sacred all the way through.
And I agree with Faith. I think one of the things that I quoted was poverty, the opposite of poverty is justice. And scripture where Mike Slaughter had turned to, and a little further, it says, "For I, the Lord, love justice." And I think if we could love doing justice and be compassionate about it, I think that will change the lives of people. Just aligning law and justice, as I had mentioned, there's a misalignment. Even if we align those, no law of man, woman, of humanhood is going to change hearts. And I think if we are compassionate about justice and love justice, that will change hearts and that will change attitudes towards the poor. And I think the poor are with us to advise us. And so I'm there on the streets just listening so that I could learn and we can learn from those in our communities. They're already in our communities. And if we could take the time to communicate God's love as God has communicated God's love to us in the incarnation of Jesus Christ, with the very presence of Christ, and Christ listening to our stories and our hearts, if we can do the same to those who are on the streets that are homeless, those that are poor, I think that'll change our world.
Go ahead.
I would go back to your question now that I've given you a short sermon. The poor will be with you always. Clearly, there are many more scriptures about poverty than that one. It is the most cited by pastors and lay people alike. And the emphasis is always, it's futile, don't try. And then I read Jeffrey Sachs' book about, ending world poverty. And then I read Jim Wallace about the emphasis is on the wrong words. The emphasis is not on poverty. The emphasis is on with you. That if there are poor people, they should be with you and you should be with them. And it'll change the way you look at the world. And the things, we do charity usually because it makes us feel good. We do justice because we're angry. That things aren't right. Things aren't pleasing to God. Things don't have to be the way they are. And when you're with poor people, they help you get angry, and hopefully angry enough that you start to demand justice.
I think I won't say I've had a Wesley experience of my heart being strangely warmed here this morning. But I think what I have learned in sitting here is that perhaps I've been too polite. Because I always try to be polite. And I've reformed myself from my days as a semi-radical in college in the 60s. And so I think one of the things that I've learned here is that my prophetic voice needs to change a bit as we speak out. And I think that will be helpful to all of us, and so I appreciate what my colleagues have said this morning, and what I've heard from you is that, we need to maybe not always be respectful, but be more firm and demanding in our approach to folks in the sense of biblical justice.
Mike, before I go, a member of the audience, did you want to say anything on these?
No, I think, as a pastor, too, one of the things, the poor will always be with you. One of my greatest frustrations is the poverty of wealth, because it creates comfort and complacency. Mm-hmm. And, I have people, it's painful to leave all the time for an easier church.
Right.
So how do you have the patience to love what Jesus loved and be, one of our executives, she was executive pastor at Gainsborough for 10 years, her name's Sue Nelson-Kibbe. She said to me, Mike, you really got a bad problem. You're an evangelist and a prophet, and both those things keep kicking each other in the ass. So how you do this as a pastor, where you and I live, there at the local church level. And again, what you have to, just like John 6, when Jesus said, many are called and few are followed, many of Jesus' disciples left and followed him no more because they said this is too hard. And I think that's the pain every week as a pastor when people leave. But you got to tell the truth.
Because you love them.
Yeah.
Jesus, the rich young ruler, comes, and the scripture says Jesus loved him. And then he says you got to give it all up. Because he loved him.
Before, I just want to say, just that passage you quoted, and if I may, I just said, one of the teachers that I had once had really flipped that passage for me, in that he said, if you look back where that is coming from in the whole context of the biblical context of care for and with the poor, that actually is not this kind of what we often take it as this kind of sense to say, well, then I don't have to worry about it. It's actually a sense that says, and so your mandate to be with and for the poor never ends. Like, you never get off of that. Like, it never ends. It's there because the poor will always be with you, and so will your call to be with them will always be with you as well. That just flipped it for me.
I have a question. I have two questions, and anybody can answer them. The one question is, being as though I'm one of the people that's living in poverty, I have found myself being homeless and without any help. I was living on the street and found myself getting in trouble. In the meantime, when I got in trouble, I ended up going to jail. And it's a misdemeanor offense. But now I can't get housing. I can't get help with anything because even though it's a misdemeanor offense, it was drug related. And I can't, like everybody's shutting the door down on me. They're denying me for everything. And I've changed my life around. I've given my life to God. And I don't understand, as soon as I'm trying to make a way for myself and it's hard. It's like life is keeping me down.
What's your first name?
Nicole.
Nicole. Kay, do you want to respond to Nicole?
I'd love to. It's Faith.
Faith, I'm sorry.
That's okay. I answered anything. Hey, lady. Well, you mentioned you're a Christian. Are you going to a church?
I've been trying to go to the church where Pastor Cindy is. I've been there quite a few times.
Okay.
But due to bus fare, it's hard.
Right. I would recommend you talk to the pastor about somebody who would, and you are not alone in running into this in terms of getting housing, in terms of getting jobs, in terms of getting kids back. All kinds of things get stymied by incarceration. So talk to the pastor about somebody who might, a nonprofit or a parishioner who might take a chance to let you start life again.
And I would really, Cindy and I know each other well. She was my student, and she is the right pastor to be connected to. So whatever you do, don't just try the church, become connected to the church, and through that you will. I know Cindy's heart, and I know her focus. There was empowerment that comes when you connect to a good community of people.
Well, the other thing is, I love Cindy to death. She knows that. We've had our ups and downs together, but she's human just like I am. But the church where she belongs to, that she preach at, the congregation, I just feel like they don't accept me that much. Like, they don't make me feel a part of. She does, all by herself. So, I mean, there's like 3 people.
We're very much at the early years, like when you were, irritating
Sure.
people and making them leave. we're still at that
So
point.
I hope you are doing some prophetic ass kicking. Okay.
I mean, when she preaches, though,
I'm going to
she
change
does,
that A to a D if we don't get with this.
when she preaches on a level where I can understand, because she deals with recovery also, and that helps me to understand, being as though I'm just learning how to read. So, but I need help. Like, I want to know the Bible. I want to learn. I want to get closer to Him. I mean, I do. I thirst for it. And being as though I have the literacy problem, I want to be able to study. And I have not found anything that helped me, except for when I was in jail. There was a pastor there, and he brought some assignments for me to be able to do. And I have a Life Recovery Bible, and it was for the King James. So it was hard for me to get the answers to study.
There was a gentleman who was about to be, Mr. Williams, executed. And the state parole board voted 3-2 to commute his sentence to life in prison. That sounds nice on the surface. But in Pennsylvania, for the governor to even receive a recommendation to commute a death penalty to life in prison without the possibility of parole, it takes a unanimous vote. Then, there was a court hearing in which information, evidence that came up, Terrence Williams, came up that showed that the man, he killed 2 men, but the case that he was going to be executed for was killing a man who had sexually abused him for a number of years. And the judge who was hearing that case strongly chastised the prosecutor because that information never came out in his trial nor in his sentencing. And so his case is still, his execution has been stayed, but it gets to the point in Pennsylvania and across the country where we don't allow the opportunity for folks for redemption, for people who have made a mistake like you, Nicole, and want an opportunity after changing your life and proving that you've changed your life. The system has been stacked up because of talking points and slogans about being tough on crime that we have closed the door to those who have changed their lives. And that may be something that we can deal with as we look for an agenda in the future. The big issue over recent years dealt with federal and state statutes that treated possession of cocaine one way and possession of crack cocaine a totally different way. Same substance, but one was used by white folk and one was used predominantly by African Americans and other non-white folk. And that has been slowly changing as people realize the injustice of that as well.
Hi, this is more directed to Faith and Mike. I'm Marcy Nicholas, and I happen to be a pastor, one of the pastors of one of those downtown urban historical churches that need a lot of work and a lot of repairs. And we have so many buildings like that are just unsustainable with the kinds of congregations we have. Yet, we one of our main ministries is that we feed the homeless breakfast every Sunday morning without fail. Anybody can come to breakfast. I mean, we have all sorts of folks who come in and join us for breakfast on Sunday mornings. Yet we have this building that any major, any repair is not just going to be $5,000. It's going to be $75,000, $100,000, $150,000. There's that tension there that in some ways you need the building for the ministry, but you can't really afford, to keep going in that building. I don't know. I'm just processing this and just wondering about your own reflection on this kind of tension, that exists for some of us in these urban areas. Thank you.
When we went into Fort McKinley, for example, the space they had, and by the way, it's not handicap accessible, so one of our cooks has no legs, so we carry him up down the steps, and as big as that ministry is, and see, so many times we work on the wineskin before we work on the wine, and so we have not invested any money in making it handicap accessible. I read somewhere in the Bible that you can carry paralyzed people. But to redo that space would cost. We have a study, and you can email Karen Smith at ksmith@ginsburg.org for the 6-month study we do on buildings and so forth to see if we're going to take the building over or if we're going to move into a shopping mall. It would cost $2.4 million to reproduce Fort McKinley space today. It cost us $119,000, which included all new. They had no children's equipment because they had children for years. So re-equipping children's spaces with flat screen TVs and murals and all children's equipment, chairs and so forth. $119,000. Now we just put a new roof on it since that time. So the $2.4 million to $119,000 to do everything. Now we still have an old boiler. When that thing ever goes out, we're going to really be in trouble. So a lot of it is like on prayers. So to do a study to really see. The other thing is, I think that, are you United Methodist? I think our denomination is in its evening hours. Just because we have too much money going into bureaucracy instead of local churches. See, you still have apportionments going up. What we need for you is and businesses do the same thing, tax abatements, for you to be in mission in your community and so forth. We need to create networks like Ginsburg has with churches. But we have to do it where we can send our people and so forth. We can't do it in Pennsylvania. We can train you, we can work with you, but we can't. You need to create. So Fort McKinley still, our church, our budget at Fort McKinley, and a free breakfast. Now here's the thing. That's how we restart all of our churches. The only thing is we don't make that separate. That's our evangelism pool. That's our church. So really connect that. That's our church. That's our people. So get into a network with some churches who are willing to take on your building projects while you can focus on your mission projects. See, it's a very thing for some suburban church to say, hey, we're going to put in, at Fort McKinley it would be a new boiler, or we don't have air conditioning at Fort McKinley, by the way, which is a bear in the summertime. So there's a lot of things we still don't have, but we're averaging, count children, over 500 people a week. And worship, in that place, but also connect. So make connections with some churches that want to make it. Don't count on the denomination, but on churches who want to network and say, hey, we want to do this. We want to do the roof at this church. But then you have to show them a proposal of the mission you're doing. Because churches want to invest in mission. They don't want to invest in brick. So it's the network that I think is important.
The tension is because the congregation has a love of the building? I think
that's part of it. I think those who are there now have certainly, moved beyond that a little bit, and I think they recognize the value of what we're doing there.
Right.
But they feel the burden of this building, which also, as you mentioned, has a Tiffany stained glass window.
Yeah. Which is so popular with young people.
Yeah. Right. Has Italian marble pulpit, lectern, baptismal font, altar.
That makes it tough.
Marcy, if I could just interrupt you, just give context. Marcy's church, Grace United Methodist Church, is located a half block from the Capitol.
Right.
It is the United Methodist Cathedral in Harrisburg, and it is a building that in the early part of the 20th century, when the Capitol burned, the legislature met in this church. So the historic significance of that church is valuable, and but their worship now is down to, it was once a very
about 1,000 members.
1,000 members, right. And now, but just to give you the context by which my office is located there as well. So
yes,
can you raise the rent?
Hey, he lets us use. Our deal is we get to use his wireless, so that's.
One of the big churches, Grace United Methodist Church in Dayton, is beautiful like that, and they're down to a handful of people. And the bishop even asked me if I wanted that church. I can't afford the $600,000 a year to take care of the building.
Right.
But what they do is they rent it out for weddings. I'm not going to build a sanctuary. I have no places for weddings. So what I do is rent churches like yours, and other people rent churches like yours. For what my son got married at Grace United Methodist Church, and I did the wedding. That's one idea. That's not a bad idea.
We do have people use our facility.
But the other thing you want to do is find next week at our Change the World conference. I've already talked to some pastors in this conference who are interested in really connecting with urban churches. If any of those pastors come to our Change the World conference next, some are coming. Jake, you're coming, right? Next week, is that this is the stuff we really work on of how we can create these networks of partnerships and so forth to get ideas and to see firsthand these kind of experiences.
I can't improve on what Mike said. I would only say to you that if it was, this may not apply to your church, but if the long-term members love the building more than they love the Lord, then you have your task as a pastor. Oh, yeah. And the second thing I heard you say was we have to have this building. No. You probably have to have a building. But, and I hear the historic, we're at a crisis point in the denomination. The church is people. The church is people. Yeah, so...
and you're preaching that word, aren't you?
I love, for instance, what Urban Village Church is doing in Chicago. Renting spaces, not getting involved in, so they can focus on ministry.
And anything we build, this is why I'm not building sanctuary. We don't have a sanctuary at Ginsburg. Is that just think of the cost of gas. And so anything I build today, future generations, more of their money is going to go into maintenance and mission. So we have to think every space we have at Ginsburg is multi-purpose. It's used for everything. Where we worship today, is a preschool playground.
Yes, please. Muriel Slanker, Redline Area Community Services and Chapel Church, which is United Methodist. And it's the southern end of York County, York District. First of all, Steve, thank you. This is the third one this year coming here, and this is tremendous. I'm just so appreciative of this. It brings up a lot more of my frustration, a lot more of my hope, a lot more of encouragement coming, which also feeds on my frustration. And I'd like to go back to what Steve finally brought out about the statistics. It's always difficult when we're in the outlying areas. I'm not urban. We used to be country. Now there's Section 8 housing all around Chapel Church. Red Lion borough is a Dave helped me, 6,000 people perhaps in Red Lion. My agency is a nonprofit, standalone, live on donations. I get a little bit of state food allotment, which of course this year was cut down $50, $70, and that hurts. It goes to York. That's wonderful. It comes from Harrisburg now, Union Deposit, all the way down to York, and it comes out to me, and maybe I can help my 300 households, which my agency covers at least 3 school districts, about 13 small towns, Dallastown, East Prospect, Wrightsville, well, kind of Wrightsville, kind of connect over some lines. The encouragement is that I am seeing the churches pull together again because there is no other way to do this. And those of us who aren't in a small town of York or a larger city of Harrisburg or Philadelphia or go Steelers Pittsburgh, sorry, they won last night. It's difficult. The Rapid Transit bus comes from York and goes through our little towns, but you have to be there at the right minute and you want to go to where they're going. And my senior citizens who come to volunteer, the little rabbit that runs up and down and stops at the stop sign outside my front door 3 and 4 times in a morning, and I'm only there public hours 9 basically to 1, 3 and 4 times, and my one senior citizen volunteer wanted to get off there instead of so that she could come in and not drive because she's mid-80s and she's not supposed to drive. And they were going to charge her an extra $1, so now she continues to drive. It's a no-win situation. So the encouragement is that I'm seeing more of the churches across the board, not just United Methodist, because I'm faith-based, not-for-profit, standalone donations. I'm seeing this happen. I've been the director for 6 years almost, and we've grown tremendously. But I'm literally averaging 16, 18 new client households a month. And a church pastor will find somebody living in their van or their car and bring them in my door. And a police officer will bring somebody in. It's happening out in the country and the small towns, and it's difficult. And I appreciate the fact that all these services, and this was touched on, and I appreciate this, my bandwagon right now for the last several years is, it looks good on paper, but it's always your proper. What about Red Lion? What about Dallastown? I can't send my household, my client families into York because they can't get the help. Well, it's supposed to come to us. Well, they can't get to York to get the help, and it doesn't really come out here. So I'm caught. And then as a church member, I'm trying to help encourage the churches to support those of us who are out there. Come and use my building if you don't have the space. Come and use my building. Let's work together. So I'm encouraged, I'm frustrated, and thank you very much to all of you.
Contact Marcia Florkey. She runs our 501c3 called New Path, which would be very similar to what you're doing. And the reason we started this separate 501c as a faith-based is that we can draw a lot of other kind of funds. But just, again, Miami County, where our main location is small towns and rural. We're 16 miles outside of Dayton. That's the one USA Today said is doubling. It has doubled in the last 6 years in poverty. We got cut just in government food sources $70,000 last year for emergency food relief. We have other situations. But she has built a volunteer, we use the word servant, a volunteer team that continues to do its incredible ministry. And in different towns, we have everything. In one town, Covington, Ohio, we have a medical warehouse facility for equipment for the uninsured and underinsured. We have clothing stores we're running and so forth, almost all of this. And some of those clothing stores, we have in one little small town a store. Michael, what is the name of that one over there in West Milton, Ohio? What do they call that? It's a store that sells donated things that are nicer. They make profit to help support it. So she's very creative with so many government cutbacks and so forth in small towns. And her name's Marcia Florkey, mflorkey at Gamesburg.org, and she can give you some suggestions of how she's making it in small towns with our 501c3s.
And if I can add, have you talked with the county commissioners? Have you talked with York Transit? Have you stirred the pot?
We are beginning to stir the pot, and the commissioners, I was mouthy enough last year when that whole change from York Food Bank to Central Pennsylvania Food Bank happened. I ended up on the review team because I was mouthy about it.
Well,
the commissioners did hear some of this because I want them to know that they need to come and talk. They need to be listening to us also, and not just.
Yeah. Well, her point, I'll repeat, is that our officials need to listen to us, but being a squeaky wheel works. And so if you don't advocate for yourselves, no one else is going to do it for you. And so that means getting out there. That means going to meetings. That means writing letters. That means, community organizing, and making sure that they hear your voice, that they hear from the people who would want to go to that food bank and volunteer but can't. And so, folks, we've become so complacent, and so part of our role for justice is standing up, and when we need to, shout. And when we need to, and it talks about it in our social principles, even going to the point of, at the extreme, civil disobedience. Not done lightly. Understand that. Because committing yourself to getting arrested is not a fun experience. But to get things done, to make change happen, we have to organize, stand up, and speak out. And so I'm just, taking what I do just a step further. And but back in your hometowns, churches are a potent force in speaking out. Mark Terwilliger is here from Susquehanna Conference, and Mark has been involved in the controversy over fracking and the Marcellus shale. And Mark's church, Beach Lake United Methodist Church near Scranton, is perhaps the social justice conscience of the Susquehanna Annual Conference. And and they've been engaging in ministry because we have folks. When you start talking about Marcellus shale and natural gas, it's a very complicated, because we have folks who have, it's brought in lots of jobs, and we even have the United Methodist Church realizing significant sums of money through a bequest of gas and mineral rights a while back. And so we're caught in that sense of economic development versus some companies that are engaged in raping the land and making people sick But you can't say that it's about everybody. You know, the wide brush doesn't always apply, and so weighing that balance, and so, but it's important to use the example of the folks in Beach Lake and in other places across this conference and across Pennsylvania. There's active groups in Allegheny County, through, I'm trying to remember the church there, but Allegheny and Butler counties, who are standing up to the money interests, who are more interested. I like profits, folks. I'm a capitalist, so I don't hate profits at all. I believe in profit with justice, of course, and so balancing all those interests, but there's groups out there, and so you can make a difference, but we have to get up off our backsides and get outside of our churches and get folks organized, not because it's political, but because it's what God calls us to do, and so we need to do that. But you can make that in your small town. You can change. You can, and the people in our churches are the ones who can do that. And it gets to everything that Mike has said, that Faith has said, that Lorenza has said. I'm not a genius. What I do is not brain surgery. But what you do is more important in getting folks in the churches to begin to embrace the fact that working for justice is local as well as global.
We've got another question.
Just actually a comment. Steve, you talked about the predatory payday lending trying to come into Pennsylvania. So hard. Well, it sounds like they've identified a demand here. So there's a need. So, what I'm trying to get at is maybe there's an opportunity for not-for-profit payday lending to compete against them if it comes to that. I was going to ask the rest of the panel, do you guys do anything like that in Michigan or Ohio? Or I know something about lending yesterday. So,
yeah.
Well, let me talk about payday lending a bit. And actually, there is not a demand for payday lending. The payday lending industry has decided, learned it's an easy way to make a profit by advertising to folks who looking for a bridge to get from one paycheck to the next. And the law that was being proposed, you would borrow $300 on Wednesday, knowing that your payday was coming up a week or 2 weeks away, and when you would pay it back you would give the payday lender authorization to go into your bank account electronically, or you would give them a signed, dated check, so that on the day that you would get paid, they would get paid back. But the research has shown it's not a demand that's there. It's not it's a scheme to make a lot of money. And Pennsylvania's banking laws prohibit it. Pennsylvania actually, for all of our warts, has one of the stronger consumer protection laws when it comes to controlling interest rates that lenders can charge and consumer finance agencies can charge. And so the payday lending situation got so bad across the country that in 2005, when the military began discovering that payday loan shops are being set up outside the gates of our military installations across the country, and so our young men and women in the military would grow short of cash before payday. They would go to the payday lenders down the road and borrow money. And so President Bush signed and Congress passed a law, I think it was in 2005, that provided an interest rate cap on lending to active service military folks and their families, a cap at 36%. Well, we laugh about 36%. The payday lenders don't do that anymore outside of military institutions, military installations, because in their model, they say 36% doesn't make them enough money. So it's not that it's the demand, it's about being able to legally take advantage of people who are vulnerable. People who really need to get money to tide themselves over between paychecks, there are lots of ways to do that besides going to a payday lender. And so, the idea of setting up some sort of micro lending is done in some communities in an informal way. As this microfinance has been very successful in starting up. We've seen what microfinance does, in India, in Africa, and even here in the United States, where organizations start with a small amount of money, and through entrepreneurship and good stewardship, do great things. But the payday lenders, their interests are not the consumer's interests. Their interests are not people who are desperate to survive. Their interest is about making money, and making money on the backs of people who they see have a need, and they're able to manipulate them into becoming their customers.
Faith, were you going to
respond to that too? I think Faith had
too?
something yesterday that was very interesting for us. We started a non-credit union, if you will, just for the church that makes loans for two purposes. One is if somebody wants to start a small business, and two is if somebody has an emergency that makes sense. I drive to work, but I lost my transmission. I can't get to work without the car. They're relatively small loans up to $1,000, but we just started a barber in a brand new shop who needed just the startup costs. So now he's got a business, his own business. We charge the same interest rate that we get on a savings account at the bank. So right now it's about 1%. It's not about making us rich. It's about helping people restart life again. And we started it I approached some people to give us roughly $50,000 to throw in a separate account, and that's how we started it.
What's your payback rate? Your percent. I mean, the percent of people who pay that back.
Over 95%. The other thing I would say is I had a problem with people on staff. We start at a decent wage. I mean, nobody's rich at Cass, but we start, at $10 an hour, which in our area is well above minimum wage. But I noticed that a lot of people were gambling, significantly gambling, every day $5 gambling. And I don't care what your view is on gambling. I just think there are better uses for their money. So like Charles Wesley, who went to the bars to come up with good music for the churches, we started our own lottery at Cass. And here's how it works. If you put at least $10 a paycheck into the 403B plan, which is like a 401k, every month we draw a name. So there's 100 employees. If everybody participates, and they don't, by the way, you could be the winner of a $100 bill. And so the odds are 1 in 100 versus the odds are whatever they are from the Michigan State Lottery. Somebody wrote the bishop on me. They just added it to my file. And
that was Jerry Bishop's that's in the bars doing it.
If you can't beat them, you find a way to help people have some financial literacy. What I don't want is somebody to work for 20 or 25 years for Cass and then become a part of the homeless population because we didn't help them think about financial security.
How much per paycheck do they have to put in?
$10.
How often you pay?
Yeah, correct.
I think Mike Slaughter's going to work this into his ministry.
Oh, my God.
You know, one of the things that we've worked real well, we have two. We have one that is a 0% payback, which is emergency, and I like the 1% payback. But we have another with a percentage, and I don't know what our percentage is, but microloans. And the one that's working right now with homeless people, helping them get started, and unemployed is a lawnmower business. Because the banks have foreclosed, same in Detroit, they have foreclosed on so many properties. Well, the government has laws about how high grass can get. So we've given microloans to homeless people and some unemployed folk. So our lawn mowing microloan business is doing very well in Dayton for starting. Because how much does a lawnmower and a weed eater cost? And so many of those loans are like in the $400 or $500 range, and people have really moved off the streets, gotten apartments, and just on lawn mowing, which is now in Ohio with global warming is about a 8-month out of the year kind of occupation when it's 80 degrees in March.
I think what we're going to do is have everybody take a minute to give a closing thought for this panel. Yeah. As we look, and then if you have additional questions, you can ask them after the session here. But why don't we start with you, Lorenza?
What are we doing? Well, I've been appointed to do nothing but communicate the love of God. And that's been my discernment, is how do I communicate the love of God? And for me, it's been being present and listening and learning. And that's a question I have for every local congregation, and also individual discipleship, and also community discipleship, because I believe in the connectional process. And so I think to ask ourselves, how do we communicate the love of God? I think it's such a simple commandment, but that doesn't mean it's easy. And so living simply does not mean simple living. So I just kind of challenge us all, including myself, because I continue to be transformed. This has been the most transformative process in my life. And after a year and a half, I look forward to the next year and a half, and then beyond that. How do we communicate the love of God? Advocacy in the local level, state level, federal level, and sustainability as well. I think that's very key for us, not only as a church, but as community. And so I just pray God's blessing upon us and upon myself also for continual transformation. Let's go out and communicate the love of God.
Mike, your thoughts?
What I have in my mission statement, there are 3 parts, and the first deal with family, but the second is my life mission is to raise up a local church that will demonstrate the kingdom of God on earth. And to any pastors who are here, when I went to this tiny little rural church, it was never my desire to get promoted to a bigger church. It was to give my whole life, even if 10 people showed up, to raise up a church that would demonstrate the kingdom of God on earth. And we're still not there. And I'm not thinking of retirement at age 61. I mean, this is a lifetime calling, Why do we keep doing this? Because a long time ago, God asked us to, and we said, I do. And so just to encourage you, you don't have to move. You don't have to go to a big place. My area has been declining in almost 34 years that I've been there. But God is working, and just to encourage you to continually raise up a movement that will demonstrate the kingdom of God on earth.
Faith.
I was talking to Mike and I didn't hear the question.
But you're giving me ideas so I can go back and demonstrate. See, you're ministering to me so I can go back and demonstrate the kingdom of God on earth.
What am I going to do with my life? Is that the question?
No.
Help me.
Really, an inspiration for the folks who are here today to continue this idea of advocacy in their communities.
Well, I sort of heard from the question from the back. I'm in a different community. I'm not in Philadelphia. I'm not in Harrisburg. I'm not in Detroit. and yet there are things going on. God is everywhere. Need is everywhere. I've been amazed these last couple years in Michigan, and I'm sure you have in Ohio, that there isn't a county, there isn't a city that hasn't been impacted by this economic tsunami, if you will. Here's a story I told yesterday. I'm walking down the hall of the Scott Building, which is our main headquarters, and I ran into a man, and he said, "Can I have some water?" And I said, "Sure." They don't often ask. We have drinking fountains everywhere. He said, "Can I have some hot water?" I said, "Okay." He said, "You don't understand, do you?" I said, "No." He said, "Well, I have a job, but my hours were cut. The owner is slashing everyone's hours, and so I don't have enough money to manage all of my bills anymore, and consequently, I've lost my utilities, including the ability to have hot water. But I learned that you can buy a bag much like a pizza bag that will keep water hot. So if you will let me, I'll come in the morning and I'll fill up my bag with hot water, and I'll go home and I'll stand in my shower." I said, "Yeah, you can have some hot water." Thinking to myself that we live in a country with somebody who has a job. So I didn't think anything about it until he does this for about 6 months. He comes in to get hot water while he's trying to deal with his bills and his decreased income. And about the third or fourth day, I noticed there was an envelope under my door that had $3. And the next day, and the next day. And sometimes it was in bills, and sometimes it was in change, but always it was $3. And it dawns on me that he's paying for his hot water. And so the next time I bop into him in the hallway, I say, "So-and-so, we don't need your money." And he said, "It's not about you." Which said two things to me. One, it's not about me. And two, if what you're doing is causing somebody else to lose their dignity, don't do it. If we can be about God's business, wherever you are, because that's where God is, you'll be amazed at what can be done. That's it.
And finally, Steve.
That's incredibly difficult to even attempt to top. Well, but I am going to ask one question here, because I think it's very important, and it gets in to what Faith just said. How many of you have contacted your state representative or your state senator in the past month? Let's see hands up high. Well, to those of you who haven't, why haven't you? Why haven't you? Well, but I'm saying is, and so we have tools, and we have your email addresses, but I think that contacting, speaking up is so important. And it's not about sitting here and listening to nice speakers for a day. It's about getting out and doing something about it, of taking a few minutes. And we have a system, those of you who receive our emails, we've got a new system, thanks to a grant that we got from the Peace with Justice Fund, that allows folks to communicate directly with their legislators, senators, representatives, and the governor. And so if you're not receiving our newsletters, make sure that I have your email addresses. I mean, I have those who signed up online. I've got yours, but make sure we have that, and that fits right into what Faith and everyone else here has been saying about doing something, getting off of our backsides, or using our fingers to do the talking.
Now, could I have a couple minutes to make a statement before you go to lunch?
I'll tell you what, we don't. We're on a rather tight schedule. I'm sorry if you could maybe interact with the folks afterwards, but thank you for your thought on that. As I said at the beginning, I'm not a United Methodist, but I am a Catholic, and I'll just share a quick story. In the height of the recession, this was maybe a couple of years ago, some people would argue we're still in the recession, but really at the height when things were extremely bleak, we got a new pastor, and it wasn't more than a month or two he had been there, and I'm in a very blue-collar congregation. He had a detailed list inserted into the bulletin of the church and talked about it, that he would like to have new chairs on the altar, new light fixtures and candelabras, et cetera, et cetera. And we don't stand up in our church and say things. So I did stand up and I left and I went out to the car and called my husband who wasn't there. And I said, talk me off the ledge because I'm about to freak out on this guy. He wasn't asking people, let's set up a food pantry. Let's set up some kind of kitchen. Let's collect clothes. Let's do something. He was worried about what the damn church looked like. And I thought, is that what Jesus really wanted? You see, I'm Irish, I'm Catholic, I get fired up. But my point would be, boy, what great, I think, information and message you gave today. Regardless of your faith, we are called to justice, to try to reach out to people and take that advocacy seriously. I work in the realm of politicians in the Capitol and trying to hold them accountable to things. But if they don't hear from the ordinary voters of Pennsylvania about what they want, they will never change because they sure as hell hear from the special interests. And too many of those special interests aren't advocating for the poor and the dispossessed. So on that little righteous note, we'll leave you this morning. Thank you so much, and thanks so much to our wonderful panel. Terrific.